All right, I want to welcome everyone to the panel room. This week, we've got a bunch of panelists here talking about time travel. So before we start, let's go around the table and let everyone introduce themselves, tell us a little about who you are and your history with time travel. We'll go ahead and start with you, Pintip.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Pintip Dunn, and I'm a New York Times bestselling author of YA fiction. I write in a wide range of genres within YA. My newest book is Dating Makes Perfect. It comes out August 18th, but as you can see, it's a rom-com, so I won't talk too much about that. The genre that I write most in is science fiction and dystopian. So my Forget Tomorrow series is about a girl who lives in a world where you can send memories back to your younger self, and she finds out that she sees a vision of her future self killing her younger sister. So in book one, the only time travel is just memories being sent from the future to the past. In book two, there is actual time travel. And in book three, there is the time stream breaking down. So that's really interesting. The other book that I have that's about time travel is called Malice. And this book is about a girl who finds out that 10 years in the future, a boy in her class will one day create a virus that wipes out half of the world. And she has to figure out if she can take his still innocent life today in order to save millions in the future. And again, this book just starts off with a voice from the future visiting her in the present, but there is actual time travel later on in the book. And in this one, I explore a lot about just how time travel might be, longer in the future and a shortened time in the past. You can go from one point in the future and go to anywhere in the past. So I play a lot about just the relative lengths of time and the relative spots that you can travel to. So,
okay, great. Clay and Susan?
We are Clay and Susan Griffith. I'm Clay, she's Susan. And we write probably best known for the Vampire Empire series, as well as Crown and Key and Flash and Arrow. We don't write a lot of time travel. So I'm assuming since we're on the panel, that means we will write time travel in the
I assume we're on the panel because of Flash.
Flash.
Flash was very inundated with time travel. So
Flash is known for using and abusing the time travel trope. So I assume, and we play with it a little bit. We can talk about that later. We sort of lead to expectations that there'll be flashy time travel in our novel, and then there isn't. But so that's basically why we're here, I guess.
Yep, okay. And then David.
So my name is David Bicot. I also write as DB Jackson. And under that name, I have just completed a time travel epic fantasy trilogy. The first book in the series is called Time's Demon. And it's written under the DB Jackson pseudonym. And in my time travel, characters who can walk through time use a device that's almost like a pocket watch that allows them to go back in time. You can go back in time and return to your present. You can't go into the future. And for every, say, year that you go back in time, you age that amount. And then when you come back to your present, you age another year. And so my lead characters are 15-year-olds who go back 14 years in time and are caught up in castle intrigue and an assassination plot, and end up having to care for the orphaned infant of a king who's killed. And they're pursued by assassins and such, but the catch is that they're 15-year-olds, but they're in the bodies of 29-year-olds. So everybody assumes they're adults, but actually they're still kids dealing with kid issues and kid emotions and all of that. And as I say, the third book has just come out from Falstaff. It's called Time's Assassin. The second book is Time's Demon, and the first book is Time's Children. And it was my first foray into writing time travel, and it pretty much made my brain explode. I'm not sure I would ever do it again. but it was an experience. I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Great. Jackie.
Hi, my name is Jackie North, and I was invited by Gail Martin to be on this panel because I've written a series called Love Across Time, which is a 6-book series that are standalone, heavily influenced by Somewhere Across Time, Somewhere in Time, the movie, The Green Bronze Mirror, The Mirror by Marilis Milhauser, all those kinds of things. I love time travel. I love the idea of the fish out of water, going back in time. I'm not really a person who would write, someone going forward in time very much, because I like historicals, but historicals are kind of not as popular in my genre. So I thought I would try this crossover. I had a lot of fun with them. Basically, my characters go back. The cute guy from modern times goes back and falls in love with the cute guy from, 1891 or 1892. Basically, that's an era I'm very familiar with for some reason. I don't know all the details. And the titles are like Heroes Across Time and Honey from the Lion. So they don't really imply that they are time travels stories. And what I think sets mine apart is I don't have like a mechanism. It might be a room where Hemingway stayed that becomes a time portal, or a stairway in an old hotel that becomes a time portal, or just standing in a storm where there's electricity and wind going around. So the mechanism by which they travel isn't as important as where they go and when they land. And I think for my time travel novels, they create an alternate timeline. So anybody else who didn't travel through time has no memory of the history that was. It's only the history that they're living in now. So I had a really good time writing those. People have been asking for more, so I'm writing little sequels to each one of them. And it's a lot of fun, but like David said, it kind of blows your mind when you're dealing with those paradoxes. They get a little tricky. My last story had him going back multiple times, and each time the history was different. He had to figure out where he was and who died, so he could save them all over again. I was like, okay, this is too much for my poor brain. I just want to write romances. So it was fun. I enjoyed it a lot.
All right, great. Nancy.
I'm Nancy Northcott, and I write the Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy for Falstaff Books. That's the first book up on the shelf behind me. And there is time travel to some degree or another in each of the 3 books. It's most important in the first book and leads to all kinds of problems. Like Jackie was saying, there's an alternate timeline, and they kind of have to figure out how that happened and how to undo it. My main experience with time travel is, well, I mean, I have a personal experience with time travel, but a lot,
Or
I grew
have
up
you?
reading, what?
Or have you?
Well, that might be a secret.
Yeah.
But
Will
I
have
grew up
been.
reading Legion of Superheroes, they had a time bubble, like a big soap bubble that they stepped into, and they went to various eras, and then they were buddies with Superboy, who just flew faster than the speed of light and went through time to wherever he wanted to go. So I just think time travel is a lot of fun. And so I write it a little bit, I read it, and otherwise enjoy it a lot.
All right, thank you. And finally, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Wynick. I'm new on the writing scene. I had released a book a couple of years ago with a different name. It's Amber Witch, Time Traveling Witch Story. I had to reissue it because I had a conflict with a pen name, and I do not write porn, but I do write time travel and historical fantasy, so trying to keep that straight. Jean Adams had invited me on this panel because I had done a multiverse academic panel on the psychological need and desire for time travel, and I explored a lot of videos, sci-fi movies, some stories, because I'm a longtime nerd. I've been an educator for 25 years, and I'm only now getting some of my work out. My next 2 books that I hope to be coming out also have historical and time travel elements, one through reincarnation and one through a ghost that just won't leave. So time travel has been kind of the little titillating sci-fi love of my life. But that's it for me.
Thank you. Now, why do you think people are fascinated with time travel? And I'll start with you, Clay and Susan.
Very frightening by it sitting together. To me, it's the aspect of course, reliving a period that you're curious about in history, but it's also the fact that you could make changes, that you can like go back and talk to a younger self and maybe fix something down the line if if something went wrong rather than right. So I think that that element of being able to either see the past or find the mechanism with which to fix your own life or fix someone else's life, like save a life or make the right turn when you probably went left in reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it works, why we enjoy watching it and writing it when we do, is it can be very poignant. We all think constantly about decisions we've made just in our lives, and had we, not gone to work the day we met somebody, or had we gone to a different place, or had we not majored in history, things might be different. So there's a real personal poignancy to time travel that makes it, I think, really attractive. I think there's some plot difficulties that some of the other writers were discussing that make it less attractive for using in a narrative. But since character usually trumps plot, it's really enticing to explore those moments or it's just exciting to explore those moments where a character or you as a person might have done something different or fixed a problem or saved someone or helped someone that you neglected to do when you should have. So.
All right. David.
Yeah, I can't add much to that. I think it's the desire to go back and change things, to see a world or a life or a relationship gone wrong, and thinking, if only I had done this, I could repair it. The thing that makes it so tricky that Quay was starting to get at there is the same element that makes it fascinating for us makes it so difficult to write. Because when you're dealing with time travel, when you can go back, when your characters can go back, you have the potential for constant do-overs. And it makes it so that any plot points that really matter, any plot points that are consequential, that are devastating, become negotiable. And as creators, that becomes tricky for us because we want our catastrophes to be irrevocable. We don't want them to be negotiable because that takes away all their drama. And so we end up having to find things that we can do with our time travel that place limits on it, that keep it from taking over the story. And that's why I have my characters aging so much, because that way a character who goes back in time, he or she can only do that so many times before they age themselves out of the ability to change history. But you need a mechanism of some sort to make some of your events immutable, because if they're not immutable, it destroys your narrative.
And you see that a lot in, say, Doctor Who, where the TARDIS disappears or quits working, decides not to work, whatever it happens. So what about, I'm sorry?
That's the thing. You got to build the rules. And as David was saying, if you build the rules into the narrative, you know which ones are, like Doctor Who had fixed moments of time. That is a moment in time that cannot be changed no matter whether you have a time machine or not. And it's those little tricks that authors put in that limit you.
I mean, I also think that people love it because it's a lot of fun. Like David mentioned his cool little thing about when you travel back in time, you have to gain so many years. Like that's fun. Like it's fun to see that because you don't see that in normal, like everyday life. I mean, it's like the saying also, like, a flap of a butterfly's wing can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world. And I think that like with time travel, you can see how like these little minute changes in the past might like, trickle forward, and you go back to the future and all of a sudden everything's totally different. And so I don't know, I just feel like for me as a viewer and reader of time travel, and I think for other readers too, I just really enjoy to be like, oh wow, that's so cool. Like that's not something that happens, in our regular world. And I think different from other science fiction, time travel, as tricky as it is, I think does feel more accessible. Like I feel like sometimes people say, okay, science fiction is this category, and time travel is a completely different category. And you see that with like the time travel romances, but like people seem to not, it feels more accessible to a wider audience, I think. I don't know if you guys agree with that or not.
Well, I recently watched a movie called Midnight in Paris. It's a Woody Allen movie, and I don't normally like Woody Allen, but in this one, this guy goes to Paris with his fiance, and he just has this affinity for the 1920s. And lo and behold, he gets an opportunity to meet Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein, and he is over the moon. He's like, oh my God, it's Hemingway. Tell me something, Hemingway. Tell me something that I can do about my writing. And Hemingway goes, if your writing is true, and if you are a brave man with a brave heart, and he starts talking like you would imagine Hemingway would. So I think part of the time travel, you know, yes, you can go back and fix things, but to live a life that you feel more in tune to, like Nancy was saying, and Sarah also mentioned, sometimes you have this affinity to a former era or a decade, like mine is 1846 to 1900. You know, I've read so many things that if I went back there, I would know how to spend money, how to communicate. You know, I know more about it than my own life. And so I think that's part of what draws people sometimes, is they just want to go back there and meet Hemingway. And I wrote a book called Hemingway's Notebook, and it got way too long, it took too long, but I had such a good time finding out about who Hemingway was. Maybe I could have a conversation with him if I was able to go back, but you know, who knows? So I'll be ready for Hemingway when I meet him. But I think that's part of it, is just this affinity to the past that people have. And they go, oh my gosh, it's 1846, I want to go there.
Right.
Nancy? And it's fun.
Actually, what I was thinking was something along those lines, which is that when the present world is grim, superheroes are a great escape. So is thinking, well, if I lived in a simpler time, because let's face it, nobody ever assumes they're going to live in the Middle Ages and be a peasant. People think I could go back and live in a castle and gallop around on a horse, and that would be simpler and everything would be cleaner, because it is if you're at the top of the food chain. And so I think there's an affinity for that, and I think it's something similar that makes people want to travel to the future, because you think all these problems will be worked out by then. It's the Star Trek phenomenon. And I think that time travel in some ways offers an escape and a chance for the reader to visit a place that's different from where they are and different from where the characters start out. So the characters in a way also escape from where they are, unless of course they land in the stew pot, and that's a whole different problem.
Rebecca.
Yeah, when I was doing that panel, a lot of what you mentioned is what I discussed, you know, the feeling of displacement or the stress in society, because we crave time travel partially reactionary to our world. But one thing the panelists didn't mention was gender roles. Sometimes we want to time travel so we could break that. You know, in Outlander, when Claire travels back in time, women get to see a woman mouthing off to someone in the Middle Ages. Or likewise, in other films, you get to be a woman. You get to wear a dress. You get to slow down. You get to have the hero. Men get to go back and be the hero of the chapter or the novel. And that's something that we are also missing in society, because our roles have become so blended and with so many expectations in society that sometimes we fantasize about what would have been if I lived whenever. And, you know, I've been watching a lot of trite TV, trying to get my mind off current events. And I'm fascinated by the number of 30-year-old plus women who want big princess ball gowns and tiaras for their weddings. And that's fantasy. So that's why they're buying the time travel romances and the adventure books. I mean, come on, when in our real life do we get to brandish a sword and skewer the person who really needs to get stabbed really hard with the pokey stick? We can't unless we read it or view it in a time travel film. So I think this is just going to grow. This field is just going to be timeless.
I would probably be burned as a witch. I won't be able to do anything I would love for that to be, but I have an inert fear of going back in time, because I know it would be not nearly as nice as I would imagine it. I would love to be back in the Old West. I would love to be going back into the 18th century, but I know for a fact that it would be a horrible time in some way.
I don't want to meet King Arthur because he probably looks like a toothless Danny DeVito. But Hemingway in that film, Midnight in Paris, what a hottie.
Yeah. I was like, yes, let's have a conversation. He was pretty cool.
Yeah, a hottie, but a misogynist, so.
So I noticed that most of you, when we talked time travel, talked about going to the past. Why is that more of a focus than, like, you know, the time machine from, you know, H.G. Wells?
Maybe because it's known. We know the facts. We know what happened in history. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. Like Rebecca said, we can postulate that it will be like Star Trek, but we don't know. But if we go back into the past, we know what happened. We know where the volcanoes were and the disasters and the bloodbaths. We can avoid those, or we think we can. You know, I have my characters going to Trinidad because I did a lot of research. Nothing bad happens there. There's no volcanoes, there's no massacres. There's one outside of Trinidad, but not inside. So I sent my characters there because I knew they would be safe. And that's, I think, why we all go into the past, unless somebody else has a different reason.
Yeah, and we can prepare for it.
Right.
Read about it. You're looking maybe for wisdom firsthand. You know, you're going back to see what herbs and tinctures did they have and healing methods, and you could be the hero or you can grow. Whereas in the future, that's where humanity's fear really is. And I think that's also what's driving historical fantasy readers. You know, the past is safer and romantic in a way because, you know, our knights in shining armor don't have body odor. But if you go to the future, like with the Martian, and you end up on Mars, good God, nobody wants that kind of future.
No, potatoes.
Yeah, I have a PhD in history, and so for me, history is a natural fascination. But also, just as an author, the idea of allowing my characters forward time travel was just, it was a place I didn't want to go. The complications, the potential, I didn't see a way to write it without totally destroying my story, and I just didn't, it was easier to set that rule. You can't go past the day you left. Whatever day you left to go back in time, that's as far forward as you can go. And that simplified my life tremendously as I was writing it. And still, it was crazy writing the books, but this simplified it.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, in contrast to everyone else, my characters do go to the future. And it's precisely what Jackie and Rebecca was saying, which is that we don't know what the future holds. And so for my characters, it was very much driven from that idea that what would happen if you find out what the future holds? What would you do in the present in order to try and change the future? Like my heroine, Forget Tomorrow, she finds out that in the future she kills her beloved younger sister. So then it was about the idea of like, can you change the future once it's already happened? And so then that gets into like, you know, the ideas of what is time travel? Are you in like one time stream, or are there alternate time streams? Is it cyclical? So it gets into like some of those tropes. And then in Malice, you know, my heroine finds out that 10 years in the future, a student creates a virus, similar to the situation that we're in now. And funnily enough, like this book actually released in February of this year. And I had no idea that we would be in this situation now. So it's almost like, you know, a little predictive of the future, even though I wrote it 2 years ago. But so I think it's precisely because the future is unknown, like that's what fascinates me about going forward. And just that idea of, you know, what if it is known, then what?
Now, David kind of touched on this, that it's very difficult to write time travel. So what do you guys, or what suggestions or tips would you guys have for someone wanting to write time travel, to do it without your head exploding or your world breaking apart? And I'll go ahead and start with you, Jackie.
Well, one thing that I had to do was do a chart on the wall, with the days in the future timeline and the days in the past timeline, so as to when the character, I had a character, and it's called For the Love of a Ghost, and he keeps going back in time to rescue this guy named Artie, and Artie keeps, and then the next day he wakes up and he looks at the history, and Artie has died a different and even more horrible way. And I thought, I'll just go in and write this, and he'll go back and rescue. I'm like, wait a minute, what day does he die? How does he die? When does the guy go back? So I had to have like a huge chart. Never do this, because multiple going back in time and changing it is more complicated than him just going back one time and falling in love and staying there. But it was a lot of fun. It was a tough mental exercise. I recommend charts on a wall. Just put it on the wall.
All right, Nancy.
The first thing I think you have to do is figure out a time travel mechanism that makes sense. I write subgenres of romance. I love lots of genres of romance, including time travel romance. But one of my problems with those books as a group is if the heroine walks in an antique shop and rubs a lamp and gets transported back to Victorian England, why didn't the last person who walked into the antique shop and picked up that lamp get transported back to Victorian England?
That's the point.
And, if there's an explanation for that, then I'm good with it. But there needs to be an explanation. And the mechanism that the author chooses has to be consistent. It's like Susan was saying about rules. You have to have rules, and you have to follow them. And so that to me is the start of it, because if you don't put the character into the time stream by a method that's logical and believable within the confines of the story world, then I think you lose the reader.
All right. Rebecca.
You really have to research your setting. You've got to know, where are you placing this story and why are you placing it in this time period? And that includes not just clothing, but language. Get comfortable there, and then figure out what percentage of the story really has to do with setting. Because when you're talking about character-driven stories, stories that have meaning, that touch others, it's not going to be the Tolkien-esque 20 pages describing the hill and the chair. So the time travel setting is a backdrop, but you have to be comfortable enough that you're not making a mistake like, putting a ballpoint pen, in the 1700s. But really think about why. What changes with the character because of the setting too, because it's like another character. It should have an impact, otherwise why are you doing it? And then what percentage of that setting is going to shape the story? What are your limitations?
Right, like my story, Honey from the Lion, you made me think of. I'm like, why did I choose, Farthing wasn't a town, it didn't exist, but why did I choose 1891 Farthing, Wyoming? And I realize it's because it puts these two characters in isolation with each other, one of whom knows the environment very well, and the other one who doesn't. It's the fish out of water trope. And I think I didn't think about it like you're saying, but unconsciously I must have been doing it that way. It's like, oh, if I put them here, they have to rely on each other, and the other one doesn't know anything about how to build a fire, how to skin a deer, any of that stuff. So the other man teaches him, and that's part of the story is brought on by that environment that you're talking about, Nancy. I think it's very important. I just wasn't thinking about it like that. I think I will moving forward.
You always have to think about why you chose that particular moment in time. When you're, you can send them back to anywhere, and
Right.
the lamp could send them anywhere. Why did it stop here? And yes, it's part of its plot, but you have to be aware that is a focal point that you're sending these people to, and you have to have a logical reason why they might have stopped there versus just, it was convenient for the author to be there.
Right.
Shapes the character's limitations and how they move through the story. I have one that I'm working on where the character is cursed and she dies by the age of 13 and reincarnates in another time period. And I do that for 5 different time periods. And it's why would I move this character from here to here to here? And each time the setting has something that could reveal more of this character, because it's the same character that's moving through time. So what can she gain at this moment, and what impact will she have, and how will it shape her choices? So it's very conscious of when I'm placing her and why I'm placing her. And that's been really helping the story move along.
And also remember that storytelling ultimately is about point of view.
Mhm.
It's getting into the thoughts and emotions of the character. And so you can have the most logically thought out time travel system in the world, and yet if you don't have your characters responding at an emotional, visceral level to what you're putting them through and allowing them to experience that sense of dislocation, of discovery, of wonderment, of fear, all of those things that are going to make up a natural reaction to what's happening to them. If you don't do those things, the time travel isn't going to ring true to your audience. And so ultimately, you have to remember that when you're writing point of view, when you're writing anything at all, you need to be in the mindset of the person who is leading your reader through the experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because it's, why do you have time travel there? Is there a storytelling reason, or do you just think it's cool? And so like in the case of my books, it's the time travel itself leads my characters to make really difficult moral decisions. Like in the Forget Tomorrow series, she finds out that she kills her sister in the future. Like she has to figure out how to get out of that. In the Malice book, she has to decide if she can take a boy's life today when he's still innocent in order to prevent atrocities in the future. And so in both cases, I use time travel very specifically to create these moral dilemmas. And, and so I think that, I think some people would just put time travel in there because it's fun, because like I said, I do think it's really fun. But like what David said, I think that if there's a purpose for it, if it ties directly into the storytelling and the choices that the characters have to make, then it has a much more personal and emotional impact for the reader.
Yeah, the show that we wrote, the novel for, The Flash, is sort of an example of both the best and the worst use of time travel. The first season of that show is as good as anything I've ever seen, and it all came down to final episode that involved time travel, where the Flash goes back to save his mother from being murdered. And it was beautiful. It was beautifully done. But these guys got to fill 25 episodes a year. So by season 2 and 3 and 4, they're realizing, you know what? We got a lot of emotional impact out of that time travel bit. Let's do it again. And let's do it again. And let's do it again and again and again. And you can only go to the well so many times. Plus, personally, it screwed us up, or it almost screwed us up. We were writing the book, and the main villain in our novel, we were in the middle of the manuscript, and we watched the episode one night, and there was a time travel episode. Barry went back in time, and when he came forward again, or he went forward and came back, the villain was now a good guy.
Oh no.
So I'm thinking, our book is supposed to be canon. So I had to get on email immediately. We had a producer contact, and I said, "What are you doing? Pied Piper is now a good guy, and he's our main villain." And the guy wrote back and said, "Don't worry about it. Probably by the time the book comes out, he'll be a bad guy again." So time travel was great, but I hope
Your timeline.
on the Flash, it's fantastic. After that, they start to kind of use it too much.
And you can overview.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Now, we have a lot of different types of time travel that you guys all cover. You've got the consciousness going back, like someone mentioned, Somewhere in Time. You've got swapping bodies, like The Mirror, and several others. What's your most influential time travel book that you've read? It doesn't have to be your favorite, but what one influenced you the most and how you are as a writer of time travel? And we'll start with you, Nancy.
Well, I don't even remember the title of it. Now, I read it in high school. It was a short story by Sir Arthur C. Clarke, and it was about a company that offered tours into the distant past. And this was the pre-human age. And there were very strict rules. You have to stay on the path. You have to do this. You have to do that. Don't touch anything. Don't mess with anything. You get to go back and look, and that's it. Well, somebody stepped on a butterfly. And when they came back to the present, everything was different. And that story, I guess I was 16 or 17 years old, and that story just really grabbed me.
I think it's called The Butterfly, I think.
Well, it might be. I should have pulled it out and looked at it before this panel, and I didn't think about it for some reason, but it might be. But that story just really made a big impression on me.
I think it's the
And
sound.
this is not the sound of thunder.
Is it?
The Thunder, yeah, Ray Bradbury.
Oh,
Because that's the one that I think of with the butterfly.
oh,
It's the sound of thunder where they go back to hunt dinosaurs.
Yes.
Okay, maybe I'm confused. So obviously it didn't make as much of an impression on me as I thought it did. But Butterfly made an impression. That much I remember.
But I remember a butterfly being involved too, for some reason.
Well, I read a lot of those little Arthur C. Clarke short story collections in high school. And that's why I was thinking it was that, but maybe it was Bradbury. Anyway, the butterfly remains the constant no matter what. So
Yeah, but there was dinosaur hunting involved. Maybe, how the hell
All right, Rebecca, how about you?
I'm more of a movie than a book timeline reader. Honestly, the recent books that I read with time travel were David's books, Times Children's books, which were brilliant. But otherwise, I'd seen it only in film. And in film, you have everything from Marty McFly to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure to Land of the Lost. And then in David's books, it was the first time I saw characters that actually had repercussions for their travel.
Sure, yeah.
Instead of that cartoony, oh my God, I'm fighting the Slee Stacks, or I've just kidnapped, Plato. Totally different time travel. And it's given me a lot of food for thought, really, because it's so character driven. But honestly, my time travel exposure prior to these newer books was bad TV, I'm trying to think of those kiddie movies that we saw. I mean, we've got it in Somewhere in Time, and we've got it with Hermione Granger with her time turner, lots of little nuanced time travel, but nothing that really explored it for me until recently.
Great. Pintip.
I would say The Time Traveler's Wife for two reasons. I love this book. It's one of my favorite books. But so in The Time Traveler's Wife, time travel is not linear. And I explore that in Malice. And what I mean by that is that the time traveler himself can go to his wife's timeline. Like he might be, an old man and come visit his wife when she's 6. And then he might come visit her when she's, 30 and he's 22. And so he travels back and forth. And so even though one character's timeline is constant, it's not linear in the sense that he can go earlier in time or later in time, and it's at different ages. And I thought that was so cool. And so I really loved that concept, and I really explored it. And the second reason I love it is because, and we've touched on this earlier too, is that book, time travel is central, but it's not about that mechanism. It's really about the characters. It's really about their love story. It's really about that romance. And that's how I like to use time travel in my books too, that it's super cool and it's a cool thing to explore and to play around with, but ultimately it's the character's story and their emotions and their bonds with each other that are important.
All right. Thank you. Clay and Susan?
For me, no different than some of the others, I was drawn to it, like first from books and some from TV. My first book was like the Doomfarers of Cormorande with Brian Daley, and all those and even in the movies like Planet of the Apes and all those are books that were shock value, where it was very disheartening to realize, like, oh, if I go into the future, horrible things are going to happen, or if I go into the past, you know, something I'm hoping that I can right or wrong. I mean, that is one of my biggest.
You're saying talking apes are horrible?
They're terrifying.
Just hit them.
Anyway, but to me, it was always going back in time, because that was in order to fix something and make it go forward. I mean, that's why I like Terminator. That's why I like, you know, I can't remember, Outlander, all those things. They have the opportunity at some point to try and make things better going forward. And to me, that's always was one of my things, even with, I think the Doomfarers, was that, you know, they had the technology, even though they were going back into the past, they had the technology, they had the know-how of how things would work better, and, you know, military-wise or whatever, and weapon-wise, to try and win the war or win the battles. And those kind of things always were the focal points for me.
I thought you'd say time tunnel, but
No.
yeah, it was great.
That's yours. James Garrett.
There's a James Darren. There's an episode of The Simpsons, one of their Halloween episodes, where Homer gets his hand caught in the toaster and it transports him in time. And
you do.
It shows both the brilliance and the foolishness of the time travel trope, but it's also oddly character-based, because he comes back and the world has changed, and like everyone has a giant cat head, and he does it again, he comes back, everything is great, but there are no donuts. So he does it again, and he comes back, and everything seems good, but everyone has like a forked tongue, and they eat by sticking their tongue out. And he goes, it's good enough. So it's beautiful character-based to show time travel, even if possible, at some point you got to stop, and you'll just take what you got. It's fantastic.
I wasn't expecting The Simpsons to be, you know, one of them, but
yeah,
it's perfect.
From The Simpsons. What do you got?
All right, how about you, David?
Well, I mean, at this point, I'll reiterate a couple of things. I do think Time Traveler's Wife is one of the most beautiful, thoughtful, just beautifully written books I've ever read. I think it handles time travel with such nuance and care. It's just beautifully done. I have to say that the first Terminator movie, I think, handles time travel really well. Unlike, I love the Back to the Future movies, but they don't do it very well. But Terminator really does. I would name a book by a friend of mine, a woman named Jana Oliver, who's a very good friend, and she wrote a book called Sojourn, that is about a time traveler who takes tourists to different times, and she takes someone back to the time of Jack the Ripper. Or, well, anyway, the time travel gets caught up in the Jack the Ripper mystery, and it's really well done. I really recommend it.
All right, and you said that was Sojourn?
Sojourn, yes, by Jana Oliver.
Okay, great. Jackie.
The first experience I had with time travel was a book called The Green Bronze Mirror, and it was written by a 14-year-old girl, and she posed in the back with a sweater and pearls. I was like, oh my gosh, a 14-year-old can write a book. So the experience this young lady has, she goes on vacation with her family in Rome, picks up a green bronze mirror, looks into it, and that's the mechanism by which she goes back. And she is in Roman Britain for some reason, even though she was in Italy, but okay. So what I liked about this was watching her adapt to her surroundings. She had to pretend to be a slave, you know, working for Roman Britain, and she had to figure out a way to get back. She meets Merlin. It kind of gets wonky in the end, but this is, you know, a 14-year-old girl. And when she comes back into the present, she's fallen in love with a guy who is also, Merlin has sent him forward. He's now a car mechanic, and they can now get married in the present. So it was a little bit fluffy at the end, but I really enjoyed being buried in Roman Britain with the idea that I could someday go home. I'm not going to be stuck there with, you know, all the weird things that they were eating back then. So I'd be like, oh, and then I was enamored. And of course, there's a whole bunch of other things, like you mentioned, all these books, you know, The Time Traveler's Wife and Back to the Future, which I fell in love with, obviously, as everybody, I'm sure everybody's seen it like a million times. But that was my first experience, and I just think that magic has never left me.
Jackie just reminded me of a book, Connecticut Yankee, King Arthur's Court.
Court.
Yeah, all the spin-offs. You know, Black
Right.
Knight, Whoopi Goldberg, also traveling in time,
Right.
Timeline, all of that basically off of that book.
The Time Bandits,
Yes.
right? The Time Bandits. So many good things out there.
So we've touched on most of the different belief systems, I guess, in time travel. You've got that every action, you've got the butterfly effect that you mentioned. Anything you do in the past could have horrible consequences. We've touched on not specifically 11/22/63 by Stephen King, where certain aspects are fixed points in time, like in Doctor Who, or you've got Terminator, which seems to be anything you've done has already happened in the past when you travel back. Which ones do you think are the easiest and why to write? And we'll start with you, Rebecca.
Well, if you have anchors in time, that gives you guideposts. So I would think at least you have those things to work with. And if you have that rule system where anything you've done impacts, it depends on what rules you're creating. But yeah, where you have that fixed signpost, that creates parameters so at least you don't go a little bit too crazy. I mean, if you took that away and you went back into the past to the land of the dinosaurs, but now it's mechanized cockroaches from some sort of scientific experiment that had gone awry and sent back this sentient AI, you've got no control there, and your audience doesn't trust you either. Because if they're picking up a time travel book, they want to travel with you, and they want to recognize a few things as they're there, and then they want to feel.
Do they want to keep it the exact same, or like you guys mentioned before, change the past? Do you think that's something that people want from the story, or do they want you to go to the past to fix something?
I think we all have to need something to read a time travel book. It's something that's lacking in our life that we're seeking. You know, we're looking for the hero. If you're dating men that disappoint you, so you read books about heroes and you sigh over this character and saying, if only Bob could be like this, okay? Or if, you're depressed about the stress in your life, so you go back to a simpler time. Or if your life is just boring, so you go and you travel the high seas because there's adventure. So I think there's always need based in why we pick up the books that we do, and time travel gives us opportunities for a new reality.
So it's not just going to be one thing, that you're going to time travel for, and not some one thing that they're looking for. Just the idea of going to a different time, they're going to have a bunch of different reasons for that one, not just one reason. Reasons they might not even understand themselves to be able to articulate it like you just did.
Pintip, how about you?
Well, I don't know if this is the easiest, but it's the most fun for me to write. So I really love the system, the Terminator system, where the time is cyclical, and when you travel back in the past to do something, the present self, it's been there all along. And so this way your older self can go back to your younger self, and then your younger self would have experienced that as they were growing up, not realizing that they were being visited by their older self until they get to that moment in time. But I just think it's so much fun because when I was talking earlier, this panel about having like those fun little surprises, those cool little moments that you're like, oh, wow, that's the way that it was. And so like for the Forget Tomorrow trilogy in book 1, I set up a whole lot of future visions that people receive. And then that they play out in some way or another throughout the rest of the books. And in book 2, they actually time travel to a scene that was in book 1, but then you see it from a completely different angle, because there were like, people in the scene that you find out later were actually, people from the future. So it's a discovery for me as a writer, as well as I hope that it's also discovery for the reader. And so that's the most fun for me. And in the sense that if it's a cyclical world, you don't have a bunch of different time streams branching off. And so in a way that does make it easier because you're not dealing with several timelines, you're only dealing with one.
Clay and Susan?
One of my favorite things of recent in terms of time travel stuff is stuff like Groundhog Day or Edge of Tomorrow with the Tom Cruise movie, where it keeps going back to a certain point and moving forward and trying to find what that one angle was, what that one thing that I need to change in order to move or to break the cycle and to try and keep going back. And those have been really fascinating to me of late. I've seen a lot of different examples coming through, but I find each one's treated them just a little bit more uniquely, going to each one. And I think it kind of keeps you in a certain area. So that helps in terms when you're writing, that you're not going to be breaking the streams or whatever. And when you do break it, it just resets. So you have to find out what's the correct path. So I think it makes it for a little bit easier. But in terms of tropes, I don't think any time travel story is really easy. I think you really have to think those rules through and set it up exactly. And even when you start doing that, you're going to find something that you've missed, that there's some little thing that's going to almost kibosh the whole thing. So having those rules, having those regulations in place, and just know that you're going to have to switch things up at any moment to try and get that to work properly in the story is quite difficult.
I was going to ask, what do you do if a wrench is thrown in?
You pray to the gods. It's a lot of writing, a lot of discussion. Sometimes you have to go back to square one and really think through your mechanism. Sometimes it's very simple. Sometimes it's a very simple fix, but it may take you a long time to figure out what that little simple fix is, or you put it in the story in some way that makes it make sense. It's very hard. I dread finding those wrenches in any plot, much less a time travel plot.
Yeah, I think
because the wrenches are things. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, Dave. No,
I was just going to say that the wrenches are usually things that you've done to yourself that you haven't thought of.
Yeah.
That you're reading through, or you're thinking about all the stuff you've done, and you suddenly realize that you've created a plot hole the size of Detroit, and that is just the worst feeling in the world, because you know there must be an answer, but for the love of God, you can't find it. And I mean, there were times writing the 3 time travel books I just did, each one of them was about 150,000 words, 140. So that's almost 500,000 words. And boy, I had so many times where the story just kind of reared up and bit me in the butt because I had done something without realizing that I'd done it and had created just nightmares for myself. So this is why I will never do this.
Did you fix them, or did you try? Were there any cases where instead of really going back and doing the plumbing to fix it, you kind of did a little hand waving and said, well, let me put a little something here and maybe they won't notice?
No, I fixed it. I went back and fixed it. Now, one of the times that I fixed it, I had to make up a rule I hadn't thought of, but the rule made total sense with all the other rules.
Yeah.
But it was just a possibility I had never even entertained. I was like, oh, yeah, you can't do that. But for the most part, I really did. I went back and I fixed it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
5 weeks.
And I'd also say, in terms of what's easiest, that if you want to know what's easiest, follow the course of my career, because I'm lazy. And I look for the easiest way to do everything that I do. And so if you're worried about writing about the past and getting it right, set your time travel in an alternate world where nobody else knows the history. That worked really well for me.
Good point.
Smart.
Let me write that down. Alternate history is
saving grace.
Yeah, I mean, you got to worry about the alternate history people, because they'll argue, the Japanese army in 1947 had 3 buttons on their tunics, not 4, so they wouldn't have been able to invade. Okay. But in general, yeah, as long as you can say, well, in my world, Algeria is really wet. then you're good.
Right.
All right, Jackie.
I'm sorry. What was the question again? I was got so into listening to people talking about this.
Talking about the different types of time travel where there's no rules, where there are points in time that can't be adjusted, where
Right.
it's all predetermined. Which is the easiest for you and why?
I think if you have like specific historical events, so I guess that's a rule-based time travel where you can't, if you change that, you're going to really mess up the world. And so you make sure that you're not going to interrupt the battle or save Lincoln or something like that. So in my time travel novels, I don't have any historical people or real historical events. I might refer to them, but people don't interact with presidents or kings or, you know, parliamentary meetings or anything like that. So I just sort of avoid that. But in the background, they're there to give the story structure more than the time travel rules. I think rules are important. Be consistent within your own story. So if he goes through time down a stairway and it feels like an elevator falling, when he goes back up, it feels like an elevator going up. You know, you want to be consistent for the reader's sake, I think. But you can really do anything you want as long as you're consistent within that story, so that the reader understands what the rules are for that narrative, and they don't get lost or confused or go, well, hey, you can't do that. That's what I think the most important thing. Be consistent.
David, do you have more to add? Since you kind of jumped in, I realized you didn't answer the question fully.
I thought I did. You asked what was the easiest thing to do, and I said it in an alternate world. You know, I've written alternate history. I've done the Thief Taker books, and I've written alternate history. I would not want to try to combine time travel with the historical research. I think that would just that would be really hard for me. You know, I kid about not wanting to do time travel again. The fact of the matter is, it was, as challenging as it was also really fun. There was one character, I had 4 iterations of her in one book, 4 different versions of her, 2 of whom meet at one point, and it was just, you know, there's so many challenges and so many things to do, but I come back to that thing, the point I made about point of view earlier. What makes those moments work is not the cool mechanism that you've built into your world, it's the emotional reaction that your character has to it, and the thing that brings it back to your reader in a very real way.
Thank you. And Nancy.
Well, to me, the easiest thing to do, and I guess I'm a masochist because I've never done it, is to have a simple mechanism for time travel. Because to me, the story, I'm not a techie person. So to me, the story is not so much about how you get there as the fish in the water trope that I think Jackie mentioned it, and the emotional stakes that David mentioned, of dealing with the fact that you are there. And if you have to be there on a mission, how are you going to accomplish your mission? If you don't belong there and you want to go home, how are you going to get home? So, and that really is a lot like writing any other kind of fiction. It's just in a different historical period. So to me, the easiest thing is to just have a simple mechanism. And, you know, when we talk about rules, DC Comics kept getting people to ask, well, why doesn't Superman go back and kill Hitler? And then we don't have World War II. So they made a rule in their universe that history could not be changed. And they did a couple of stories where like Superboy went back and tried to save Lincoln and stuff like that. Didn't work because history can't be changed. So that to me is a simple rule. And if you want to go with that rule, which I don't particularly, it makes it easier. But I think it also wipes out a lot of challenges if nothing you do is going to have any consequences going forward.
Thank you so much. And just one last question for all of you guys before we get into talking about where people can find you. If you had access to a time machine, would you use it, and where would you go? And we'll go ahead and start with you, Pintip.
Oh gosh. I don't think I would go to the past. I think I would be too terrified of changing something. And something we didn't talk about that is in a lot of time travel movies is that you go back in time and then all of a sudden your children are no longer born, or they're not who you remember them to be. There's some children totally different. And so for that reason, I would never go to the past because I can't risk changing my children's identity. I would love going to the future. I mean, since I write about that, but I think it would be really fun to see what it looks like, and then you don't jeopardize, you don't jeopardize your own life in the present.
All right. Clay and Susan.
Well, sort of similar to her answer, as long as there's a little label on the time machine going, you're not going to screw anything up, and that's fine. I'd probably go back to the Italian Renaissance for the hats, but it's sort of, the hats are great, but it depends on what I'm interested in that weekend. Probably it might be the Old West, it might be Victorian England, it might be colonial Africa, but right now it would be the Italian Renaissance. Pantaloons are nice.
I would probably go to some place that I felt comfortable, or where I would I could get enough money that I could just live off the grid and not really be worried about changing anything. So I would probably go to either the Old West, or that would feel super comfortable just living out by myself somewhere, and then get killed by Indians. I always have a bad thing that always happens to me whenever I think about going back to the history. So it's hard to pinpoint, but.
You have died of it?
I have died of it.
Dysentery, according to Oregon Trail.
Oh, is it dysentery?
So there's always something that's going to get me, but I'm curious about certain aspects of Victorian life and in the Old West and stuff like that. Even though I know it's nothing like what I imagine I would like it to be, it's always going to be a lot worse. But if I had lots and lots of money and lots of ways to stay safe, maybe I would go back in time.
All right, David.
Well, I was gonna say something about going back and visiting myself when I was in high school and slapping some sense into myself. But you raise a really interesting point about not wanting to change. I mean, I love my kids, I love my wife, I have a very nice life right now, and I wouldn't want to do anything, including give myself confidence when I was 16, that might change where I wound up. And I certainly wouldn't go back to the Wild West because I've just watched Deadwood. Yeah. So I think actually what I would really like to do would be to go back and just see my parents when they were young and experience, not interacting with them, but just see what they were like when they were young. I think that would be fascinating. And seeing my grandparents when they were young, that sort of thing. Someplace where I could do this without doing any damage, and where I knew that I could get a clean glass of water and a toilet that didn't make me want to, throw up. Those would be my priorities.
Great answer. Jackie.
I would go back to London, 1846, just because I've read so much about that era. I've read all of, Dickens stuff. I know how to get from one end of town to the other, how much a cab costs, how much rent costs. For some reason, I know all these things. And then I would leave London before the cholera epidemic in 1858 and go out to Cornwall because things were peaceful out there. And that's where I would go. Or 1851, which is the Great Exhibition of London, which was when toilets were introduced to society. Everybody fell in love with them. So there's your plumbing, David. That's when the toilet came in. Don't go back before then, because you will not have what you need, and neither will I.
All right, Nancy.
I would go back to one of two places. I would either go back to Roanoke Island circa 1586 and see what happened to the lost colony.
I know.
Or I would go to the Tower of London in the late fall of 1483 and see where Richard III's nephews went, because I'm pretty sure they were not buried under the staircase. Because if they had been, once the Tudors arrived, there would have been many, many people coming out of the woodwork to say they were there and then they disappeared. it was a royal household, and I think they just packed up, mounted up, and moved out. And Richard didn't tell anybody where he sent them because he didn't want Henry Tudor to be able to find them. But I would like to go back and see if I'm right about that or if I'm just totally off the wall.
Or you were responsible because you went back in time to look.
Oh, no, let's not do that.
And finally, Rebecca.
My first instinct, as a teacher for 25 years, is to go back to Elizabethan England and, get a couple of pence ticket to see live Shakespeare. But other than that, I'm thinking early 1900s. Grandparents came over from Russia to New York in the early 1900s, Age of Innocence times. Theodore Dreiser, I'd love to see the boroughs of New York. I'm from upstate New York, and see the boroughs back when it wasn't pretty, but it's a time period that was so rich of culture, with the different neighborhoods moving in. I think I'd want to visit it briefly because I know where my family cast would be. I wouldn't last long, but I think it would be nice to see the neighborhoods back when it started.
Great. And I want to thank everyone for participating. And let's go around and tell the audience where they can find you on your social media. We'll start with you, Clay and Susan.
Where can you find us?
You can find us at clayandsusangriffith.com and just spell out and. You can find us on Twitter at Clay and Susan, and you can also find us on Facebook at Clay and Susan. So reach out, and we're happy to chat with you about anything, time travel or otherwise.
All right, David.
davidbco.com, and there are links there to the DB Jackson website, so you can find all my stuff through the David B. Co site. I'm on Facebook as David B. Co. I'm on Twitter as David B. Co. and also as DB Jackson author. And yeah, I'm around. I make myself known.
All right, thank you. Jackie?
You can find all of my social media information on my website, www.jackienorth.com, and Jackie is spelled Jackie, and all the Twitter and Facebook and the reading group, all of it's on there.
All right, Nancy.
My website is nancynorthcott.com. I spend far more time than is good for me on Twitter, where I'm at Nancy Northcott. And I have an author page on Facebook, which is Nancy Northcott Author.
All right, Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm also found RebeccaWynick.com, Facebook, Rebecca Wynick -writer, and Twitter at Rebecca Wynick. So you can find me there.
Great. And finally, Pintip.
Yeah, so my website is pintipdunn.com. I'm on Twitter at Pintip Dunn, Instagram Pintip_Dunn, and Facebook author Pintip Dunn.
All right. Again, thank you, everyone. And thanks for watching. This has been the panel room. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yay.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, everyone.